March 21st, 1987, 4:37 p.m., Palm Springs, California. Frank Sinatra's private compound on Wonder Palms Road. The phone rings in the living room. Frank is 71 years old, sitting in his favorite leather chair, reading the Los Angeles Times sports section. He's wearing khaki slacks and a navy cashmere sweater. A glass of Jack Daniels sits untouched on the side table. The ice has almost melted. The phone rings a second time. Frank doesn't move. He hates being interrupted. His housekeeper, Vine, appears in the doorway. "Wait, Mr. Sinatra, it's Mr. Rizzo. He says it's urgent." Jilly Rizzo, Frank's best friend, his bodyguard, his shadow for 30 years. Jilly doesn't call something urgent unless it actually is. Frank sets down the newspaper, walks to the phone, picks up the receiver. "Yeah." Jilly's voice is shaking. In 3 decades, Frank has never heard Jilly's voice shake. Not when they got death threats from the mob. Not when the FBI tapped Frank's phones. Not ever. "Frank, it's Dean Paul. His plane went down over San Gorgonio. They found the wreckage. There are no survivors." Frank doesn't say anything. The room is completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. 5 seconds pass. 10. Then Frank speaks. 4 words. "I'm going to Dean." He hangs up, calls his pilot. "Get the Gulfstream ready. We leave in 1 hour." Calls his assistant. "Cancel everything for the next week." And then he makes the hardest call. He dials Dean Martin's number in Beverly Hills. Dean's daughter, Dina, answers. She's crying so hard she can barely speak. "Is your dad there?" He's in his room. He won't come out. He won't talk to anyone." "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him he's not alone." Frank Sinatra hangs up the phone. 71 years old. A man who built an empire on never showing weakness. A man who controlled rooms with a glance, who made presidents nervous, who once told off the entire Nevada Gaming Control Board without blinking. That man walks into his bedroom, sits on the edge of his bed. And for the first time in decades, Frank Sinatra cries. What happened in the next 3 days revealed something about Frank Sinatra that the public never saw. Something that had nothing to do with power or fame or the Rat Pack mystique. It showed who Frank really was when the cameras were off and the music stopped. And it explains why Dean Martin, even in his darkest hour, called Frank Sinatra his brother. To understand what Frank did, you need to understand who Dean Paul Martin was. Not just to Dean, to Frank. Dean Paul Martin, called Dino by everyone who loved him, was born November 17, 1951. Dean Martin's son, Frank Sinatra's godson. Not officially, but in every way that mattered. Frank had watched Dino grow up, taught him to throw a baseball, gave him advice about girls, showed up at his tennis matches when Dean was on tour and couldn't make it. Dino was everything Frank wished his own son, Frank Jr., could have been. Not that Frank didn't love Frank Jr. He did, desperately. But Frank Jr. lived in constant fear of his father's shadow. Dino didn't. Dino was confident, athletic, a champion tennis player who competed at Wimbledon, an actor who didn't need his father's name to get roles, a musician in the rock group Dino, Deasy, and Billy, and perhaps most impressively to Frank, a captain in the California Air National Guard flying F-4 Phantom jets. Frank respected that more than anything. Dino wasn't trading on his father's fame. He was serving his country, flying one of the most dangerous machines ever built, risking his life because he believed in something bigger than himself. Dean Martin was proud of his son, but he also worried. Every time Dino flew, Dean would sit by the phone. Frank knew this because Dean told him. Late nights after shows, in Frank's dressing room, when it was just the two of them and a bottle of bourbon. Dean would talk about Dino, about being afraid, about not understanding why his son needed to fly jets when he could have had an easy life in Hollywood. Why does he do it, Frank? He doesn't need to prove anything. Frank understood, because Frank had spent World War II performing for troops while other men died overseas. And even though the doctors said he wasn't fit for service, even though he raised millions for the war effort, Frank carried guilt about that his entire life. He saw Dino's military service as honorable, as redemption for what Dean's generation couldn't always give. "He's doing what we should have done, Dag," Frank said, using his nickname for Dean. "He's being a man. You should be proud." Dean was proud, terrified, but proud. March 21, 1987, started as a routine training mission. Dino and his weapons system officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, took off from March Air Force Base at 1:52 p.m. The weather was terrible. Heavy clouds, limited visibility, high winds, the kind of weather where prudent pilots stay on the ground. But this was a scheduled training exercise, and military pilots don't cancel for bad weather. That's the whole point of training. Learning to fly when conditions are dangerous. At 1:54 p.m., Dino's jet requested permission to turn left, away from a massive cloud bank rolling over San Gorgonio Mountain. The controller approved. But in the swirling white chaos, with zero visibility and instruments as the only guide, something went wrong. The jet didn't turn away from the mountain. It turned into it. Traveling at over 400 miles per hour, the F-4 Phantom slammed into the granite face of San Gorgonio. The impact was instantaneous. There was no time to eject, no time to scream. One moment, Dean Paul Martin was flying. The next, he was gone. He was 35 years old. The search and rescue team couldn't reach the crash site for 3 days. The same storm that killed Dino prevented helicopters from flying and turned the mountain into an avalanche zone. For 72 hours, Dean Martin sat in his Beverly Hills home, waiting, hoping, knowing, but not accepting. Frank arrived at Dean's house on March 21st at 7:15 p.m., less than 3 hours after getting the call. He didn't bring an entourage, didn't bring photographers, just Jilly Rizzo and a small overnight bag. Frank Sinatra, who traveled with an army of assistants and bodyguards who demanded presidential suites and magnum bottles of champagne, showed up at his friend's door with one bag and no fanfare. Dina let him in. The house was full of people, family, friends, people who didn't know what to say or do, everyone trying to help, everyone making it worse with their presence. Frank walked through the crowd without acknowledging anyone, went straight to the stairs, climbed to the second floor. Dean's bedroom door was closed. Frank knocked once. "Dag, it's me." Silence. "I'm coming in." Frank opened the door. The room was dark, curtains drawn. Dean was sitting on the edge of his bed in the same clothes he'd been wearing when he got the news, a white dress shirt and gray slacks. He hadn't moved in hours. He was staring at the wall, not crying, not speaking, just staring. Frank sat down next to him, didn't say anything, didn't try to offer comfort or wisdom, just sat there. Two old men in a dark room, one destroyed by grief, one refusing to let him face it alone. After 10 minutes, Dean spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. "They said he didn't suffer. Instantaneous, they said. You think that's true?" "Yeah, Dag, I think that's true. I told him not to fly in bad weather. Last time I saw him 2 weeks ago, I told him, 'Be careful up there.' He laughed at me, said he'd flown through worse. He was good at what he did. Doesn't matter how good you are when a mountain's in your way." Frank didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. They sat in silence for another hour. Then Frank stood up. "When's the last time you ate?" Dean didn't answer. "Come on, we're going downstairs. You're going to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. You're eating." This was the Frank that most people never saw. Not the charming crooner, not the swinging playboy. The Frank who took charge when someone he loved was falling apart. Dean was the laid-back one, the guy who never let anything bother him. Cool hand, Dean they called him. But with his son dead, Dean had no foundation. He was drowning. Frank became the foundation. He went downstairs, told everyone to leave, not rudely, just firmly. "Dean needs space. I'll call if we need anything." Within 20 minutes, the house was empty except for Frank, Dean, and Jilly, who stationed himself by the door like a sentinel. Frank went into Dean's kitchen, made scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, brought it upstairs on a tray, set it on Dean's lap. "Eat." "Frank, I can't." "Eat, Dag. Just a few bites." Dean ate. Not because he wanted to, because Frank was there. Because Frank's presence was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Frank stayed 3 days, slept on Dean's couch, made meals, answered the phone, handled the press, dealt with the Air Force officials, organized the funeral logistics, paid for everything without asking. When the press tried to camp outside Dean's house, Frank had Jilly move them back. When the Air Force wanted to schedule a memorial, Frank coordinated the details so Dean didn't have to. The funeral was held on March 26, 1987, at Los Angeles National Cemetery. Full military honors. Hundreds of people attended. Frank sat in the front row next to Dean. When the honor guard presented Dean with the folded American flag, Dean's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Frank reached over, held Dean's hand steady, helped him grip the flag. The entire ceremony, Frank never let go of Dean's arm. As if by physical contact alone, he could hold his friend together. After the funeral, everyone expected Dean to bounce back. He was Dean Martin. Nothing bothered Dean Martin. He'd joke about it, make light of it. That was his way. But Dean didn't bounce back. He retreated, stopped performing, stopped going out, stopped answering calls. His other friends gave him space, figured he'd come around eventually. Frank didn't give him space. Frank called every single day. Sometimes Dean answered, sometimes he didn't. Didn't matter. Frank kept calling. "Dag, it's Frank. Pick up the phone. I know you're there. Okay? You don't want to talk. Fine. I'll talk. I saw Sammy yesterday. He's asking about you, says he misses you. I told him you're doing okay. You are doing okay, right? Call me back." 6 months passed. Dean was disappearing. Not physically, spiritually. Frank watched his friend of 40 years fade away. And Frank Sinatra, who never begged anyone for anything, came up with a plan. The reunion tour. Frank, Dean, and Sammy Davis Jr. Together again, one more time, like the old days. The Rat Pack rides again. Frank pitched it to Dean in person, showed up at his house unannounced, walked into Dean's living room where Dean was watching the television in the dark. "We're going on tour." Dean didn't look away from the TV. "No." Not asking, Dag. Telling. You, me, Sammy. 20 cities. Like the old days. "I'm retired, Frank." "You're not retired. You're hiding. There's a difference. I don't want to perform anymore. I don't care what you want. You're doing it anyway. For me. Because I need you." That was the key. Frank Sinatra, who never admitted needing anyone, told Dean he needed him. And Dean, broken as he was, couldn't say no to that. The Ultimate Event Tour launched in March 1988, exactly 1 year after Dino's death. 29 cities, 40 shows. Frank was 72, Dean was 70. Sammy was 62 and dying of throat cancer, though he hadn't told anyone yet. The first few shows were rough. Dean was distant, going through the motions. But he was there, and being there was the point. Frank thought performing would heal Dean, thought the music, the audience, the brotherhood of the stage would bring him back. For a few shows, it seemed to work. Dean would crack a joke, sing a duet with Frank, smile at something Sammy said. But it wasn't real. It was muscle memory. Dean's body was on stage. His soul was still on that mountain with his son. The breaking point came in Chicago. Airy Crown Theater. Dean was supposed to sing "Everybody Loves Somebody," the same song he'd been singing for 25 years, the same song Frank had heard him sing 1,000 times. Dean walked to the microphone. The band started playing. Dean opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He stood there, silent. The band kept playing. 30 seconds passed, a minute. The audience thought it was part of the show, but Frank, watching from the wings, knew better. Dean set the microphone down, walked off stage, went straight to his dressing room, locked the door. Frank followed, knocked. "Dag, open the door." "Go away, Frank." "Not happening. Open the door or I'm breaking it down." The door opened. Dean looked 100 years old. His eyes were empty. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can. We'll take 5 minutes. Go back out there together. I'll sing with you." "No, Frank, I mean I can't. The music, the shows, all of it. Every time I open my mouth to sing, I see Dino's face. Every time I look at the audience, I think about how he's not there. I can't. I'm sorry." And Frank Sinatra, the man who bulldozed through every obstacle in his life, who never accepted defeat, who once said, "I'm for anything that gets you through the night," looked at his best friend and realized he couldn't fix this. Some pain is too deep, some losses too great. "Okay, Dag, okay, go home." Dean left that night, flew back to Los Angeles, never performed publicly again. The tour continued without him. Frank and Sammy finished the remaining shows, but something was broken. The Rat Pack was dead, not because they stopped performing, because the heart had gone out of it. Frank kept calling, every day, for the next 7 years. Sometimes Dean answered, sometimes they'd talk for 5 minutes about nothing. Golf, the weather, old friends, never about Dino, never about the pain. And sometimes Dean wouldn't answer. But Frank kept calling anyway. December 25th, 1995, Christmas morning. Dean Martin died in his Beverly Hills home. Heart failure, respiratory failure, the official causes. But Frank knew better. Dean died of a broken heart. He'd been dying slowly since March 21st, 1987. It just took 8 years for his body to catch up to his soul. Frank was 80 years old when he spoke at Dean's funeral. Frail, unsteady. His voice was a shadow of what it once was. But he insisted. He stood at the podium, looked out at 1,000 people, and said what needed to be said. Dean was my brother, not in Hollywood, in life. When the world wanted a piece of him, I saw the real him. The guy who loved his kids more than anything, who never recovered from losing his son. People say Dean was cool, that nothing bothered him. That's not true. He felt everything. He just didn't show it, except to the people he loved. And I loved him. I always will. Frank's voice broke. He had to stop. 30 seconds of silence. Then he finished. "Goodbye, Dag. Save me a seat up there." 3 years later, May 14, 1998, Frank Sinatra died. Heart attack, the official cause. But those close to him knew he'd been fading since Dean's funeral. The Rat Pack was his family. First Sammy in 1990, then Dean in 1995. Frank was the last one standing, and he was tired of standing alone. Here's what the history books won't tell you about Frank Sinatra. They'll tell you about the mob connections, the 4 marriages, the violent temper, the imperial ego, and all of that was true. But there was something else, something Dean Martin knew, something Sammy Davis Jr. knew, something Frank showed in those 3 days in March 1987 when he dropped everything, flew to his friend's side, and just stayed. Frank Sinatra understood that real power isn't about control. It's about showing up. It's about sitting in a dark room with someone who's drowning and not trying to fix them, just being there. It's about calling every day for 7 years, even when they don't answer. It's about holding someone's hands when they're shaking so badly they can't hold a flag. That's not the Frank we see in movies. That's not the Frank the gossip columns wrote about. But that's the Frank that mattered, the one his real friends knew. When Dean Paul Martin died, Frank Sinatra could have sent flowers, could have made a phone call, could have done what most celebrities do when tragedy strikes someone they know, express condolences and move on. Instead, he showed up. He stayed. He tried to save his friend. And when he couldn't, when Dean walked off that stage in Chicago and Frank realized the pain was too deep to heal, Frank let him go. But he never abandoned him. Some friendships are about good times. Some are about business. Some are about convenience. And some are about standing next to someone when they're falling apart and refusing to let them face it alone. That was Frank and Dean. 40 years. Through the highs and the lows. Through fame and failure. Through joy and tragedy. And when Dean needed him most, Frank Sinatra showed up. That's not a legacy written in platinum records or box office receipts. It's written in the small moments, the phone calls, the meals made, the hand held steady. That's who Frank Sinatra really was. Not the voice, not the chairman of the board, not old blue eyes. A friend who showed up, who stayed, who never let go. Maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from Frank Sinatra's life.